Hello again, 122. In this video of Chapter 27, we will evaluate the problems in China from 1949 through 1976 when Mao Zedong was the leader of China. And in the fall of 1949, China was at peace for the first time in 12 years. The newly victorious Communist Party, under the leadership of its chairman Mao Zedong, turned its attention to consolidating its power base and healing the wounds of war. And its long-term goal was to construct a socialist society. But its leaders realized that popular support for the revolution was based on the party's platform of honest government, land reform, social justice, and peace, rather than the utopian goal of a classless society. That is an ideological belief. Accordingly, the new regime temporarily set aside Mao Zedong's stirring exhortation of 1926 and adopted a moderate program of political and economic recovery known as the New Democracy. And this New Democracy, patterned roughly after Lenin's new economic policy in Soviet Russia in the 1920s, we talked about that. The new Chinese leadership tacitly recognized that time and extensive indoctrination would be needed to convince the Chinese people of the superiority of socialism. In the meantime, the party would rely on capitalist profit incentives to spur productivity. Manufacturing and commercial firms were permitted to remain under private ownership, although with stringent government regulations. And to win the support of the poorer peasants, who made up the majority of the population, a land redistribution program was adopted, but the collectivization of agriculture was postponed. In a number of key respects, the New Democracy was a success. About two-thirds of the peasant households in the country received land and thus had reason to be grateful to the new regime. But on page 718, ladies and gentlemen, this land reform in action, this program also had a dark side. They put wicked landlords on trial, and many of them were actually punished, and some of them were actually put to death in this process. And spurred by a official tolerance for capitalist activities and the end of internal conflict, the national economy began to rebound, although agricultural production still lagged behind both the official targets and the growing population, which was increasing at an annual rate of more than 2%. But Mao is not happy. He wants to see the transition to socialism begin. And in 1953, party leaders launched the nation's first five-year plan, patterned after similar Soviet plans, which called for substantial increases in industrial output. Lenin had believed that mechanization would induce Russian peasants to join collective farms, which, because of their greater size and efficiency, could better afford to purchase expensive farm machinery. And it didn't work there. But the difficulty of providing tractors and reapers for millions of rural villages eventually convinced Mao that it would take years, if not decades, for China's infant industrial base to meet the needs of a modernizing agricultural sector. He therefore decided to begin collectivization immediately in the hope that the collective farms would increase food production and release land, labor, and capital for industrial sector. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, until the problems of food production are solved, the industrial base cannot begin to grow. You've got to be able to provide enough food first before anything, and excess labor then can be used for industry. So beginning in 1955, virtually all private farmland was collectivized, although peasants were allowed to retain small private plots, and most businesses and industries were nationalized. Collectivization was achieved without provoking the massive peasant unrest that had taken place in the Soviet Union during the 1930s, but the hope for production increases did not materialize. How can they? They haven't done it at the local level yet. And in 1958, at Mao's insistent urging, party leaders approved a more radical program known as the Great Leap Forward. Existing rural collectives, normally the size of a traditional village, were combined into vast people's communes, each containing more than 30,000 people. These are cities now, and these communes were to be responsible for all administrative and economic tasks at the local level. The party's official slogan promised hard work for a few years, happiness for 1,000. And that comes from S. Carnot, Mao and China, Inside China's Cultural Revolution, New York Press, 1972, page 95. The communes were a disaster. Administrative bottlenecks, bad weather, and peasant resistance to the new system, which, among other things, attempted to eliminate work incentives and destroy the traditional family, thousands of years, the classic unit of Chinese society, combined to drive food production downward. They weren't doing it before, and now over the next few years, as many as 15 million people may have starved. Unbelievable. And in 1960, the experiment was essentially abandoned. Although the commune structure was retained, ownership and management was returned to the collective level. Mao was severely criticized by some of his more pragmatic colleagues. And he will then begin the great proletarian cultural revolution later in the 60s, because Mao is not yet ready to abandon either his power or his dream of a totally egalitarian society. And in 1966, he returned to the attack, mobilizing discontented youth and disgruntled party members into revolutionary units soon to be known as Red Guards, who were urged to take to the streets to cleanse Chinese society, from local schools and factories to government ministries in Beijing, of impure elements who, in Mao's mind at least, were guilty of taking the capitalist road. And supported by his wife, Jiang Xing, and other radical party figures, Mao launched China on a new forced march towards communism. And this is an example of punishing China's enemies during the Cultural Revolution, which on one hand, the Cultural Revolution began in 1966, and it's a massive effort by Mao Zedong and his radical supporters to eliminate rivals within the CCP and the government. And this individual was accused of taking the capitalist road, and they would be subject to public criticism and removed from their positions. And some were imprisoned and executed. And this victim wearing his dunce cap is on public display. And the so-called Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution lasted 10 years, from 1966 to 1976. And some Western observers, again, we just discussed that, view it as a political power struggle between Mao Zedong and Liu Shaoqi and Mao's designated successor, Deng Xiaoping, the party's general secretary. And both were removed from their positions during the Cultural Revolution, and Liu later died, allegedly of torture, in a Chinese prison. But real policy disagreements were involved. Mao and his supporters feared that capitalist values and remnants of feudalist Confucian ideas would undermine ideological fervor and betray the revolutionary cause. He was convinced that only an atmosphere of uninterrupted revolution could enable the Chinese to overcome the lethargy of the past and achieve the final stage of utopian communism. This is an ideological belief. It's not based on reality. Mao's opponents argued for a more pragmatic strategy that gave priority to nation building over the ultimate communist goal of spiritual transformation. Deng Xiaoping reportedly once remarked, "Black cat, white cat, what does it matter, so long as it catches mice?" But with Mao's supporters now in power, the party carried out vast economic and educational reforms that virtually eliminated any remaining profit incentives, and they established a new school system that emphasized Mao Zedong thought and stressed practical education at the elementary level at the expense of specialized training in science and the humanities in the universities. School learning was discouraged as a legacy of capitalism, and Mao's famous Little Red Book, officially Quotations of Chairman Mao Zedong, a slim volume of Maoist aphorisms like the black cat, white cat that Deng mentioned, and they're to encourage good behavior and to maintain revolutionary zeal. And this was hailed as the most important source of knowledge in all areas. It's madness. And the radicals' efforts to destroy all vestiges of traditional society were reminiscent of the Reign of Terror in revolutionary France, when the Jacobins sought to destroy organized religion and even created a new revolutionary calendar. Red Guards rampaged through the country, attempting to eradicate the four olds: old thought, old culture, old customs, and old habits. And they destroyed temples and religious sculptures, and they tore down street signs and replaced them with new ones carrying revolutionary names. At one point, the city of Shanghai even ordered the significance of colors and stoplights to be changed so that red, the revolutionary color, would indicate that traffic could move. But the mood of revolutionary ferment and enthusiasm, that's difficult to maintain. And key groups including bureaucrats, urban professionals, and even many military officers did not share Mao's belief in the benefits of uninterrupted revolution and constant turmoil. Inevitably, the sense of anarchy and uncertainty caused popular support for the movement to erode, and when the end came in 1976, the vast majority of the population may well have welcomed its demise. And in the next video, we will go over changes under Deng Xiaoping, who comes back from exile.